Captain James Parker of the Corps of Engineers supervised the construction of the approach trenches, his men working under intermittent sniper fire from Moro sharpshooters positioned among the rocky crags above. The engineering work required both courage and technical skill, as each yard of trench had to be carved from the volcanic rock while maintaining proper angles. To avoid enfilade fire, Parker, a West Point graduate with experience in Cuba and previous Philippine campaigns, understood that siege warfare demanded patience and systematic execution rather than heroic charges. Inside the crater fortress, Dr. Emil recognized the changing nature of the American assault. The methodical approach of trench construction indicated that his enemies were prepared for a protracted siege rather than seeking quick victory through direct assault. This development presented both opportunities and challenges for the Moro defenders, who possessed limited ammunition and food supplies, but maintained the advantage of interior lines and superior defensive positions. The Moro leader deployed his most accurate marksmen to positions where they could harass the American engineers, understanding that slowing the construction of approach trenches would prolong his force's ability to resist. These sharpshooters, armed with captured Krag rifles and Spanish Mausers, possessed intimate knowledge of their weapons' capabilities and the terrain's characteristics. Their disciplined fire forced American engineers to work primarily during hours of darkness, significantly slowing the pace of construction. By midday, Pershing had committed additional artillery pieces to counter battery fire against suspected Moro sniper positions. The mountain guns, positioned at carefully surveyed locations around the volcano's base, could deliver precise fire against targets identified by forward observers. However, the Moro skill at camouflage and their knowledge of every cave and crevice on the mountainside made effective counter-sniper operations extremely difficult. According to military historical records from American-History.net, the siege tactics employed at Bagsak reflected lessons learned from previous conflicts in the Philippines and demonstrated the evolution of American counterinsurgency doctrine. The systematic approach represented a departure from earlier campaigns characterized by rapid movement and frontal assault, acknowledging that fortified positions required different tactical solutions. Private Thomas Anderson, a farm boy from Ohio serving with Company C of the 8th Infantry, found himself assigned to one of the forward sap positions. As American trenches crept steadily up the mountain's slope, the 19-year-old soldier had enlisted seeking adventure and regular pay, but the reality of siege warfare proved far different from his romantic notions of military service. Each night brought dangerous work extending the trenches under cover of darkness. With the constant threat of Moro raids against the forward positions, the defenders launched their first major counterattack at 3 o'clock in the morning, as a carefully selected group of Moro warriors emerged from concealed positions to assault the American trenches with kris and brong. The sudden violence of the attack, accompanied by the traditional war cries of the defenders, caught several American sentries off guard. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the narrow confines of the approach trenches before reserves could arrive to repel the assault. Corporal William Martinez, a veteran of previous Philippine campaigns, found himself face-to-face with a Moro warrior wielding a traditional kris. In the confined space of the forward trench, the close-quarters combat that followed tested both men's courage and skill, with Martinez ultimately prevailing through superior training with the bayonet. Such encounters became increasingly common as American positions moved closer to the crater's defensive perimeter. The counterattack, while ultimately unsuccessful in permanently disrupting American operations, demonstrated the defenders' continued ability to take offensive action despite being besieged. Pershing noted in his dispatches that Moro morale remained high and that the fortress's defenders showed no signs of the demoralization that typically accompany prolonged siege operations. This psychological resilience would require additional pressure to overcome. As the third day concluded, American trenches had advanced to within 200 yards of the crater's rim in several locations. The systematic approach was succeeding, but at considerable cost in time and casualties. Both sides prepared for what promised to be the climactic phase of the battle, with American forces positioned to launch coordinated assaults from multiple directions, while the Moros concentrated their remaining strength for the final defense of their stronghold. The night sounds of continued digging and preparation from both sides indicated that June 14th would bring the decisive phase of the Battle of Bagsak, with neither side showing any indication of yielding ground in what had become a test of will as much as military capability. June 14th, 1913, began before dawn with the heaviest artillery bombardment yet unleashed upon the crater fortress of Bagsak. General Pershing had concentrated every available gun, for what he intended to be the decisive assault, understanding that prolonged siege operations risked intervention from other Moro groups. Throughout the Sulu archipelago, the pre-dawn barrage shattered the volcanic stillness with thunderous explosions that could be heard across Jolo Island, announcing to all that the climax of the rebellion was at hand. From multiple positions around the mountain's base, American artillery crews worked with practiced efficiency to maintain a continuous bombardment of the defensive positions. The gunners, many of them veterans of the Spanish-American War and previous Philippine campaigns, understood that their accuracy would determine the success of the infantry assault to follow. Each round was carefully aimed at specific defensive positions, identified through days of patient observation and reconnaissance. Within the crater fortress, the earth shook continuously as high explosive shells detonated against stone fortifications and earthworks that had taken months to construct. Emil moved among his warriors despite the bombardment, his presence providing reassurance to defenders who knew that this day would likely determine their fate. The Moro leader had conserved his ammunition carefully over the previous days, ensuring that his warriors would have sufficient cartridges for the final battle. At 0600 hours, the artillery barrage lifted and shifted to targets deeper within the crater, as Pershing launched his coordinated assault from 4 different directions simultaneously. Companies of the 8th Infantry, supported by Philippine scout battalions, emerged from their approach trenches and advanced across the final distance to the crater's rim. The complexity of coordinating multiple simultaneous assaults tested American command and control capabilities under combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Scott led the primary assault from the eastern approach, his battalion advancing through smoke and debris left by the artillery bombardment. The veteran officer had served throughout the Indian Wars on the American frontier and understood that the final phase of siege warfare required both courage and tactical skill. His soldiers moved in disciplined formations despite the difficult terrain and the psychological pressure of approaching a fortified position held by desperate defenders. The Moro response was immediate and devastating. From positions that had survived the bombardment, defenders opened fire with everything they possessed, captured American rifles, Spanish Mausers, and traditional weapons wielded with deadly effectiveness. The crater's rim erupted in muzzle flashes as warriors who had waited patiently through days of bombardment finally engaged their enemies at close range. The volume of defensive fire surprised American officers who had expected the artillery to suppress most resistance. According to historical documentation from military sources, the assault on Bagsak represented one of the most intense small unit actions of the entire Philippine-American War period. Combination of difficult terrain, fortified positions, and determined defenders created conditions that tested American small unit leadership and individual soldier training to their limits. Every yard of advance required careful coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting artillery. Sergeant Patrick O'Malley of Company B, 8th Infantry, found his squad pinned down by accurate rifle fire from a stone fortification that had survived the bombardment. The Irish immigrant, who had enlisted in the army to escape poverty in New York's tenements, demonstrated the initiative that characterized American non-commissioned officers by organizing a flanking movement that neutralized the position through coordinated fire and movement. Such individual acts of leadership proved decisive in overcoming prepared defensive positions. The fighting intensified as American soldiers reached the crater's rim and began engaging defenders in hand-to-hand combat among the stone fortifications. The confined space of the volcanic crater concentrated the violence, with individual battles raging around every defensive position. The Moros' traditional weapons proved effective in close combat, while American soldiers relied on bayonets and superior training to overcome defenders who fought with fanatical determination. By noon, American forces had established footholds at 3 points along the crater's rim, but Datu Emil's warriors continued to resist from positions throughout the fortress. The Moro leader himself was observed directing the defense from a central stone fortification, his presence inspiring continued resistance despite increasingly hopeless odds. The sight of their leader still fighting encouraged individual warriors to maintain their positions, rather than attempting to escape. The afternoon brought house-to-house fighting within the crater, as American soldiers methodically cleared defensive positions. Each stone shelter required individual assault, with defenders fighting to the death rather than surrendering. The intensity of the combat reflected the cultural and religious significance that the Moros attached to their resistance, transforming what might have been a routine military operation into a clash of civilizations with profound implications for both sides. As evening approached on June 14th, It became clear that the final phase of the battle would extend into the following day. Despite significant gains, American forces had not yet achieved complete control of the fortress, and Moro resistance continued from scattered positions throughout the crater. Both sides prepared for what everyone understood would be the final day of fighting in a conflict that had already lasted far longer than anyone had anticipated. The pre-dawn hours of June 15, 1913, brought an eerie quiet to Mount Bagsak as both American and Moro forces prepared for what all participants understood would be the final day of fighting. General Pershing, his uniform dust-stained and his face showing the strain of 4 days of continuous operations, reviewed the tactical situation with his staff officers. The crater fortress remained partially in Moro hands despite the previous day's gains, with Dato Emil and his remaining warriors occupying a cluster of stone fortifications. In the crater's center, the American positions along the rim provided commanding fields of fire into the crater's interior, but the volcanic landscape offered numerous hiding places for determined defenders. Pershing understood that the final phase of the battle would require careful coordination to avoid unnecessary casualties among his own forces, while systematically eliminating the remaining pockets of resistance. The general had learned from previous campaigns that hastily executed assaults against fortified positions inevitably resulted in heavy losses. Within the stone fortifications of the crater's center, fewer than 100 Moro warriors remained under arms, their ammunition running critically low after 4 days of intense fighting. Dato Emil, his traditional robes torn and bloodstained, moved among his followers offering final words of encouragement and instruction. The A's leader understood that no relief would come and that surrender was not an option, given the cultural and religious significance of their resistance. The final assault began at dawn with a concentrated artillery barrage, directed specifically at the remaining Moro positions in the crater center. American gunners, their weapons now positioned along the crater's rim for maximum effect, delivered devastating fire at point-blank range against the stone shelters, harboring the last defenders. The bombardment was the most intense of the entire battle, designed to neutralize as much resistance as possible before the infantry assault. Captain Robert Mitchell of Company A, 8th Infantry, led his men down into the crater as soon as the artillery barrage lifted. The young officer from Virginia had graduated from West Point 3 years earlier and found himself commanding soldiers in combat that was both more intense and more personal than anything his military education had prepared him for. The confined space of the crater meant that every engagement occurred at close range, with officers and enlisted men fighting side by side against desperate defenders. The resistance that greeted the advancing Americans demonstrated the Moros' determination to fight to the end rather than accept defeat. From positions among the volcanic rocks and stone shelters, the remaining warriors opened fire with their last ammunition, each shot carefully aimed for maximum effect. Traditional war cries echoed across the crater as defenders prepared for hand-to-hand combat with weapons that had served their people for generations. According to historical accounts from endeavors.unc.edu, the final phase of the Battle of Bagsak involved some of the most intense close-quarter fighting of the entire Philippine-American conflict. The combination of religious fanaticism, cultural resistance to foreign occupation, and personal loyalty to Dato Emil created a situation where surrender was simply not considered by the defending warriors, regardless of the tactical hopelessness of their situation. Private James Sullivan, a recent immigrant from Ireland serving with the 8th Infantry, found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a Moro warrior wielding a traditional kris inside one of the stone shelters. The desperate nature of the fighting was unlike anything he had experienced in previous encounters with Filipino insurgents, as these defenders seemed determined to take as many Americans with them as possible. Only superior training and equipment allowed American soldiers to prevail in such encounters. By mid-morning, American forces had systematically cleared most of the remaining defensive positions, but the fighting continued around Dato Emil's final stronghold, where the Moro leader and his most devoted followers maintained their resistance. The stone fortification that served as the command post had been reinforced over months of preparation and provided excellent protection against small arms fire. Direct assault would be necessary to eliminate this last pocket of resistance. The final assault on Dato Emil's position required coordination between multiple infantry units and supporting artillery fire delivered with precision to avoid hitting American troops. In adjacent positions, Lieutenant Colonel Scott personally led the assault, understanding that the successful conclusion of the battle required aggressive leadership. At the critical moment, The veteran officer's presence inspired his soldiers to overcome their natural reluctance to assault a fortified position held by desperate defenders. The death of Datu Amil, fighting to the end with his traditional weapons alongside his most loyal followers, marked the effective end of organized resistance within the crater fortress. The Moro leader's body was found among the ruins of his final stronghold, surrounded by evidence of the fierce fighting that had characterized the last moments of the battle. His death symbolized the end of the Moro rebellion and the establishment of effective American control over the Sulu archipelago. As the morning of June 15 progressed, the sounds of gunfire gradually diminished and finally ceased altogether. As American forces completed their systematic clearance of the crater fortress, the 4-day battle had ended with complete tactical success for Pershing's forces, but at a cost that reflected the determination and courage of both sides in a conflict that transcended simple military occupation to encompass fundamental questions of sovereignty, resistance, and the price of empire. The silence that settled over Mount Bagsak on the afternoon of June 15, 1913, carried a weight that all participants understood marked the end of an era. General Pershing stood among the stone ruins of what had been Datu Amil's final stronghold, his weathered face reflecting both the satisfaction of tactical success and the sobering reality of the battle's human cost. Around him, soldiers of the 8th Infantry and Philippine Scouts methodically searched the crater fortress, documenting casualties and securing any remaining weapons or intelligence materials. The American victory had been complete, but costly. Official reports would later document 14 American fatalities and 21 wounded during the 4-day battle, casualties that reflected both the intensity of the fighting and the effectiveness of Moro defensive tactics. Among the dead was Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the Irish-born veteran whose squad had led multiple assaults during the siege. His death symbolized the sacrifice required to establish American control over the southern Philippines. For the Moro defenders, the cost had been catastrophic. According to military historical sources cited by American-History.net, between 200 and 400 Moro fighters, including women and children who had taken refuge within the fortress, perished during the battle. The high casualty count reflected the Moros' determination to fight to the death rather than surrender, as well as the American tactical doctrine that emphasized the complete elimination of resistance rather than accepting partial victory. Captain James Parker supervised the engineers as they began the systematic destruction of the crater fortress's defensive works, ensuring that the position could never again serve as a stronghold for resistance against American authority. The demolition work required careful planning to avoid casualties among the soldiers conducting the operations while thoroughly eliminating fortifications that had taken months to construct. Each stone wall and defensive position was methodically destroyed using explosive charges. The broader implications of the Battle of Bagsak extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Jolo Island. The death of Datu Amil and the destruction of his fortress effectively ended organized Moro resistance to American rule throughout the Sulu archipelago. Other Datas who had been considering rebellion recognized that continued resistance would result in their own destruction, leading to a period of relative peace that would last until the Philippine independence movement gained momentum decades later. General Pershing's conduct of the siege operation demonstrated the evolution of American military doctrine in response to the challenges of colonial warfare. The methodical approach, emphasizing artillery preparation and systematic infantry assault rather than costly frontal attacks, reflected lessons learned from previous campaigns in the Philippines and would influence American military thinking for generations. The success at Bagsak validated siege warfare tactics that would later prove relevant in other conflicts. The international response to the Battle of Bagsak proved more muted than the controversy that had surrounded the Dajo operation 7 years earlier. The systematic nature of Pershing's operations and the clear military necessity of eliminating the fortress reduced criticism from humanitarian organizations that had condemned earlier American actions in the Philippines. However, the battle's outcome reinforced growing concerns about the human cost of maintaining American colonial empire for the surviving Moro population throughout the southern Philippines. The battle's outcome carried profound cultural and psychological implications. The death of Datu Amil, who had symbolized resistance to foreign domination for an entire generation, marked the end of traditional leadership structures that had defined Moro society for centuries. The survivors faced the necessity of adapting to American administrative systems while preserving what they could of their cultural identity. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Scott, who had led much of the actual fighting during the siege, found himself tasked with establishing civilian administration in areas previously controlled by the defeated Moro leaders. The veteran officer understood that military victory was only the first step in establishing lasting American control, requiring the development of administrative systems that could maintain order while respecting local customs and traditions wherever possible. The soldiers who had participated in the battle carried its memories throughout their subsequent military careers, with many going on to serve in the European battlefields of the First World War. Under Pershing's continued leadership, the tactical lessons learned during the siege of Bagsak would prove relevant in trench warfare on the Western Front, where systematic approaches to fortified positions became the norm rather than the exception. Private Thomas Anderson, the Ohio farm boy who had served in the forward trenches throughout the siege, found that his experience in the Philippines had transformed him from an inexperienced recruit into a seasoned soldier. Like thousands of his comrades, he had gained first-hand knowledge of the realities of colonial warfare and the personal cost of maintaining American imperial commitments in distant lands. The Battle of Bagsak thus marked not only the end of the Moro Rebellion, but also a significant milestone in the development of American military capabilities and colonial administration. The lessons learned during 4 days of intense fighting would influence American military doctrine for decades to come, while the battle's outcome established the foundation for American control over the Philippines that would last until World War II. The dawn of June 16, 1913, broke over a transformed Mount Bagsak, its crater fortress now reduced to rubble and its defenders consigned to history. As General Pershing prepared his official dispatches to military headquarters in Manila, he understood that the Battle of Bagsak represented far more than a tactical victory. It marked the definitive end of armed resistance to American rule in the southern Philippines and established precedents that would influence colonial policy throughout the 20th century. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw rapid changes in the administrative structure of the Moro province, with American military governors implementing new policies designed to prevent future uprisings while incorporating surviving Moro leaders into the colonial government structure. The death of Dr. Emil had created a power vacuum that American authorities moved quickly to fill, appointing cooperative local leaders who accepted American sovereignty in exchange for limited autonomy in cultural and religious matters. Pershing's tactical conduct of the siege operation established him as one of America's premier military leaders, leading directly to his selection to command American expeditionary forces. During the First World War, the methodical approach he had demonstrated at Bagsak, emphasizing careful preparation and systematic execution rather than impulsive assault, became hallmarks of American military doctrine that would prove invaluable in European trench warfare for years later. The battle's significance extended beyond military circles to influence American foreign policy and public opinion regarding colonial responsibilities. Unlike earlier Philippine campaigns that had generated significant controversy, the systematic nature of the Bagsak operation and its clear strategic necessity helped legitimize American presence in the region. Public support for maintaining colonial control increased following reports of the battle's successful conclusion. For the Moro people, the battle's outcome necessitated fundamental changes in their relationship with both American authorities and the broader Filipino population. The destruction of traditional military leadership forced Moro communities to develop new forms of political organization that could operate within American administrative systems while preserving essential elements of their cultural identity. This adaptation process would continue throughout the American colonial period. According to historical analyses referenced in The Nation magazine, the Battle of Bagsak demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic siege warfare against irregular forces, but also highlighted the human cost of such operations when conducted against populations that refused to acknowledge defeat. The battle became a case study in military academies worldwide, illustrating both the tactical requirements for successful siege operations and the broader implications of such victories. The soldiers who had participated in the battle found their experiences shape their understanding of warfare and colonial service. Throughout their subsequent careers, many veterans of Bagsak went on to serve with distinction in France during the First World War, where their experience with fortified positions and systematic assault tactics proved invaluable in trench warfare conditions that bore striking similarities to their Philippine service. Captain Robert Mitchell, the young West Point graduate who had led his company in the final assault, later wrote extensively about the tactical lessons learned during the siege. His analyses of small unit leadership under extreme conditions influenced military training programs for decades, emphasizing the importance of aggressive leadership and careful coordination in assault operations against fortified positions. The destruction of the Bagsak fortress also marked the end of traditional forms of Moro military organization that had resisted foreign conquest for centuries. The warrior culture that had defined Moro society since before Spanish colonization could no longer sustain itself against modern military technology and systematic siege tactics. This cultural transformation had implications that extended far beyond military considerations to encompass fundamental changes in social organization. The international military community took full note of American tactical innovations demonstrated during the battle, particularly the integration of artillery support with infantry assault operations in mountainous terrain. European military observers studying the campaign's conduct identified techniques that would later prove relevant in Alpine warfare during the First World War, where similar terrain and fortification challenges required comparable solutions. The Battle of Bagsak thus stands as a definitive moment in the history of American colonial expansion, demonstrating both the military capabilities that enabled such expansion and the human cost involved in establishing colonial control over resistant populations. The 4-day siege operation illustrated the evolution of American military doctrine from frontier warfare to modern colonial administration, establishing precedents that would influence military policy well into the 20th century. The legacy of Dr. Emil and his final stand continued to inspire Moro resistance movements throughout the American colonial period and beyond, serving as a symbol of cultural resistance that transcended military defeat. While organized armed resistance ended with the battle, the memory of Bagsak provided inspiration for subsequent generations of Moro leaders seeking to preserve their cultural identity within changing political structures. As American forces departed Mount Bagsak in the days following the battle, they left behind not only a destroyed fortress, but also a transformed society that would spend subsequent decades adapting to the realities of colonial rule while maintaining essential elements of traditional culture. The Battle of Bagsak had ended the Moro Rebellion, but it had also begun a new chapter in the complex relationship between American imperial ambitions and indigenous resistance that would continue to influence Philippine history throughout the 20th century and beyond. The volcanic crater that had witnessed such intense fighting gradually returned to nature, but the lessons learned during 4 days of siege warfare in June 1913 continued to influence military doctrine, colonial policy, and the broader American understanding of the responsibilities and challenges inherent in maintaining overseas empire. The Battle of Bagsak had achieved its immediate tactical objectives, but its broader historical significance would continue to resonate long after the last shots were fired on Mount Bagsak's blood-soaked slopes.